Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 163 in the series. I wrote it down this time so I could remember. I'm calling this one If Only because I have the ONLi Blouse by Ankestrick to talk about. I think last time I left you right about here, so there's a lot more to talk about with the finishing of that blouse. And I have Hamish the cow. Hamish the needle felted Highland cow is finished. So we're going to talk a little bit about applying the hair, which is a really interesting process. And I have a good book recommendation for you if you're interested in needle felting. I also have the winner of our giveaway. So lots and lots to talk about here. If you are coming back to the podcast, welcome back. I'm doing this two weeks in a row, whatever that is. I'm back on schedule because the book is finished. And thank you so much for all of your sweet, wonderful comments about the book being done. I really appreciate it. It's a huge process. It's a kind of lonely process. And to have you all just be in here with me doing this finishing work for the book too, it's really supportive and I appreciate it so much. So thank you. We'll see how it goes. I'll keep you updated on what happens with the book now that it's actually written. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, this is usually a podcast about knitting garments and modification. So we are going to talk about lots of different things with the ONLi Blouse today. But I make a lot of other stuff, as those of you who are coming back know. So we are going to talk about needle felting as well today. And it was so fun to read your comments on the last podcast because I kind of asked, who else does things other than knitting garments? Because I know a lot of you knit garments, and so many of you just came, it came out of the woodwork, all the different things that you make and do, from rug hooking to wet felting soap to spinning and crochet, and just, you guys ran the whole gamut. So I really appreciated hearing all the, that there are others of us out there who are doing many things, including knitting. So thanks for that. And the last thing I usually do before we get started is to tell you where you can find me, and that is at knittingthestash.com. That's where all my online classes are about garment modification and design. My personal D-stash, which has gotten quite large, is over there. I think there are still some freebies up there. I can't remember if they all went immediately. The electric spinning wheel, the eel wheel, definitely went fast. But there's plenty of yarn over there, sweater quantities, pretty yarn in my personal D-stash. I also have the Flock Farm Yarn Shop over there, and that's where I feature small batch yarns from around the United States. So check them out, support them if you can, and you'll see lots of wonderful yarn and fiber. We have fiber in the shop now, so yeah, check that all out. Shorn 5, I know a bunch of you were asking about it. It's coming. There's only a couple sleeps before Shorn 5 comes out. Shorn 5 is my independent small batch yarn that I try to produce every year. It tends to be more like every other year because of the speed at which milling happens. So Shorn 5 is going to come out. I believe it's going to be September 15th. And newsletter subscribers will get a first dibs on that one. So if you want to be on the newsletter, go over to knittingthestash.com and to sign up for the newsletter. And then that will be the way to know when Shorn is officially launched. We have 2 patterns this year. You get a little sneak preview in the last episode. We have 3 colors. It's a DK weight yarn in a brown, a gray, and a white. And we've got a couple of patterns that were put together by Erica Field. So it's going to be a really fun launch. And it's barely a month left before we get into Shorn 5. So I'm very excited about it, and I hope you all are too. And I'll start posting some little teasers over on Instagram. And we've got an interview with Erica Field coming out on YouTube the same day when the yarn launch happens. So yeah, lots of really fun stuff coming up. I'm pretty excited about it. So there we go. All right. So that's where you can find me, knittingthestash.com. Let's talk about the ONLi Blouse. This is an Ankestrick creation. And I mentioned before, I just knit another one of Ankestrick's. It was more of a shirt called it was called Surfs Up. Striped, beautiful, kind of lightweight, superwash yarn shirt, which I'm kind of looking forward to wearing in the fall as a layering kind of thing underneath other, jackets and things like that. So this is a summer shirt. I don't usually do kind of summer tanky things. But I mentioned this last time, I like the fact that there are no sleeves. So I might get addicted to knitting these as well. It's a little bit fast to finish, even though this is a fingering weight yarn. And I mentioned last time, this is a blend. I believe it's a silk wool There might even be some linen in there. I wish I had the tag. I don't have the tag on me, but it's the same yarn that's recommended for the pattern. So if you go over to the ONLi Blouse and look at which yarn she's using, you can also check out my Ravelry project page where I always post notes about everything. So it's a blended yarn that's not 100% wool, so it has this beautiful drape to it, but I found that it actually has some really great memory, so that it's not, like I've knit sort of summery things out of linen and cotton before, and both of those are, as those of you who have been knitting a long time know, those are a little bit tricky because if your tension is not spot on, it will show, because those yarns don't have a kind of elasticity or memory to them that wool does. But this has a little bit of a memory to it, and it's got a little bit of a structure. So even though I washed it, I was a little worried about washing it. Like when you wash superwash yarn, when you wash cotton, when you wash linen, it can kind of like soften and kind of like, ooh, you know, that's like my best impression of squishy yarns like that. But this one I washed it and it actually came out better because it smoothed some of the tension. I was working in a magic loop, so I was pulling through the cord, you know, every once in a while, and I was trying to pull through the cord on the sides so that the transitions wouldn't be as noticeable. And you can see here, I can, if I'm looking for it, I can see just a little bit of tension difference, like for example right here where I know I was pulling that cord through, but since it's a slightly variegated yarn that does have some wool in it, and I was making those transitions on the sides, I'm pretty happy with the way that it washed out. It washed out a lot of those, any like little tension problems for the most part kind of got washed out, so I'm pretty happy about that. And I think where I left you last time, I was way up here. I had just joined the two fronts together, right? This is a sweater that's constructed from the top down. You do some really fancy footwork up here with short rows and shaping, and then you make the back pretty much straight down, and then you make both of the fronts separately and then join them at the v-neck, and then you work your way down. So I think I mentioned this last time, one of the tricky things is that I'm always working out of gauge, almost always. And I think a lot of us are, right? This is a problem that a lot of us face, is that the designer gives you one gauge, and then if you're either working, even if you're working in the pattern yarn, you often are working in a different gauge, just because our hands are different, our needles are different, we knit differently, just, you know, 100,000 things lead to different tension. And if you're within range, 1 or 2 stitches, you can usually make things work by going up or down a size in the sweater. I talk all about this in my beginning modification class over on knittingthestash.com, how you can adjust for gauge and things like that. But if you're way off, or if you're knitting in a completely different yarn, or you're trying to really make some radical changes, it can get a little bit tricky. So I know that for me, one of the things that was tricky about this knit was that my stitch gauge was off, but my row gauge was also off. And this particular pattern, last time I spent some time talking about how I don't think it's a beginner's pattern for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is there aren't a lot of stitch counts given. So if you don't have stitch counts from the designer, you know, for example, a summary stitch count about how many stitches you're going to have once you join the sleeves, the front and the backs, you know, whatever it is, your break for the sleeves or whatever it is that you're doing. If you don't have those kinds of summary stitch counts, it's pretty hard to do the sweater math, to go backwards, to see like, oh, okay, I want my sweater to be 37 inches around, or 40 or 60 or whatever it is. You can usually use those summary stitch counts to do the math backwards based on the gauge of the pattern, and then based on your gauge to figure out how to adjust things. This pattern doesn't include hardly any stitch counts, and the stitch counts that are included are not summary stitch counts. So you have to do a little bit of math to understand that, like the number of stitches on the front and the number of stitches in the back, you have to add those together. And in this case, you're actually not. It's an interesting blouse because you're not adding stitches at the underarm. Normally when you join, you know, your front and your back as you're working down and kind of split for the sleeves and the body, you would add stitches here. But this blouse actually removes stitches because you have this continuation of the pattern here, of this really cool line going down the sides. You're actually taking stitches away at this point. So you have to be planning for all of that in advance. And I actually didn't. I know, like, slap my wrist. Tell me, yeah, I'm the one that's usually telling you all, like, modify in advance, like, check your stitch counts, read the pattern all the way through. I know. Every once in a while, even those of us who do that kind of, who know that, will still just wing it and just be like, this will be fine. So I got to this point in the pattern and realized that I was actually going to be subtracting stitches. So luckily for me, I realized that kind of up here somewhere, and I was able to add just a couple of increases that weren't called for in the pattern to get myself, I actually added enough increases. I think I added back in about 18 stitches, if you can believe that. So I added a couple on the front, and I don't think you can see them. I added a couple extra along the armhole, and then I added a couple in the back. And the back, if you look very closely, there's one here. I think I did 2 rows of them. There's one here. So there's 1 row here and 1 row here where I added extra increases. So that when I had to take away the stitches to join the front and the back, so that there would be this line coming down, so that when I took away those stitches, I had basically added in the almost very close to the same number of stitches that were going to be deleted. Yeah, there was a kind of moment of panic because I really was somewhere, very close to where the armholes were going to end, and I was going to need a certain number of stitches to make sure that the chest circumference was going to be okay. So it was a little bit of a touch and go situation, I have to say. I wasn't sure how this yarn would handle extra increases, just in the plain stockinette fabric, so I tried to hide them in little strategic places. But luckily, as you can see on the back, where I hid them, you have to sit and stare at it for a while. You can see one here, like I said, and you can see one. Ooh, they're hard to see, aren't they? Well, I did a good job then. And I think the other thing I did is I may have put a few right here in the center, kind of like you would with if you were doing shaping to a sweater. You can add shaping in this area. So I knew that would be an okay area to add them. And then I also think you can see them right over here. So in this area, as it's coming down to the armhole, I added some of those increases. So there are a couple places you can do it, even if it's a last minute, last ditch kind of like, oh boy, this is getting sketchy. I think the model is actually dropping. Can you all see it on the camera? I have to run around and look. It's one of those strange things. I think it slowly, I don't know, was it like that in the beginning? Maybe it just slowly dropped, maybe it didn't. Anyway, here it is in all of its glory. So hopefully you could see what I was talking about. I think so, because I was focused on the upper part here. So I did have to do that adjustment, which was a little bit wacky. And the other thing is that since my row gauge was a little bit off, I'm actually, I need to measure this now that the sweater is finished. I'm thinking the depth of the V-neck, I think it actually looks like it did on her version. When I was knitting it, it looked higher. It looked like it wasn't going to sit as this low because my row gauge was a little bit off. But that's another thing to think about when you're knitting sweaters that have kind of features like that come to a point, say, a V-neck, or if there's cables, there's lace or something that needs to end at a certain place, and you are working out of gauge, you definitely want to try to figure out the best placement for those kinds of things. There are, for all of us, I'm sure, certain places on our bodies where we wouldn't want, like, a big bold flower to pop up in the wrong spot, or like the lace to end in a weird place. I think in the end, after this got washed, I think this measurement is pretty close to the original, but I don't know. Here's what I don't know. When I put it on, and I'll put pictures in here, I feel like the V-neck ends up sitting a little bit higher proportionally than a lot of V-necks that I'm used to. So that's another thing to think about, is just maybe if I were doing another V-neck like this, I would probably take a garment that I really like the fit of, and I would measure how deep the V is, just to get a sense of what to my eye, what I think proportionally looks good. And then I would work backward in the pattern so that as I was working the shaping for the V-neck, I could add or subtract, to make it wider, scoop lower, scoop higher, whatever it is, based on that measurement. So that's something to think about. I didn't think about it with this pattern because I just thought it looked nice on her, the way that it kind of sat on her collarbones. I think my body shape is just a little bit different than hers, and so I'm not positive that this is like the perfect proportion for me, but you have to look at the photos and see what you think. But just a tip, you know, if you are working on a sweater with a v-neck or any other kind of feature that's going to end in a particular place, think about how and where you want that if you have a different gauge. The other things after joining for the sleeves, which I mentioned, subtract instead of add. An interesting feature of this pattern. It worked out really well. I like the way that this feature works and looks. You can see that it's a pretty simple little feature where you just have a couple of purl stitches on either side of a row of, or a bit of stockinette. And you could really accentuate that with blocking if you wanted to block this out. I just let it kind of sit and block flat. The armholes, I did work the openings for the piece of elastic, which I have not put in yet. These armholes, you can see they sit kind of just, they don't really do much. When you put the elastic in, it creates a little bit of a bunch, you know, a bunching effect right around the arms, which I've mentioned in the last episode. I think I like, and I'm excited to kind of try that out. So I have my little hole here marked so that when I can insert the elastic, it will go around. I think I'm gonna run, based on your comments, I think I'm gonna run the elastic all the way down to the underarm here. If not, if I don't attach it here, I'll at least attach it on either side. I've never done that before with elastic, so we'll see. The other option with this sweater would be to pick up stitches and actually just do little sleeve caps. And I'm kind of torn because, I don't know, it's one of those things where it depends on how you feel about your shoulders and your upper arms and like where something's hitting you. I have very wide shoulders, so this hits me right at like the widest point and makes me kind of look a little bit like I'm wearing shoulder pads. Great for the 1980s, not so great maybe now. So I think the elastic will soften that and kind of pull this in a little bit, which I'm looking forward to seeing. Otherwise, I mean, I think there are other things you could do. You could kind of ruche this up, which would be kind of cool. You could do it temporarily speaking, and you could do it permanently. These are all things that I would probably ask Spencer to do with his sewing machine, or you could just do like a piece of, like an I-cord. That would be kind of cool. You could tie an I-cord here and have it hang down so that it was just kind of a nice feature. I really like that, the way that might look. Or like I said, you could pick up sleeve stitches and do a little cap. It would be kind of a drop shoulder. You wouldn't really do a full sleeve cap because this is already out at the edge of the shoulder. So anyway, I have to think about that. But those are a few of the things that, you know, as I was knitting this, I was like, these are interesting features of this pattern that people might want to know about. The last thing I'll mention is the finishing work on the hem, which is pretty awesome and time consuming. So it is a turned hem at the bottom, which I think is really nice. And I was worried it was going to flare out. Sometimes when you turn a hem at the bottom of a garment, depending on how tightly, you know, your stitches are, if you're whip stitching or what you're doing, it can kind of like flip out. Same thing can happen if you have the wrong tension on your ribbing, or if you're going from cables to ribbing, you know, you'll often see a flare, like a pop out at the bottom, and that can really bug people. It can bug me. I know it bugs me. So I was concerned about that. I was curious, but I was like, I'm going to go through this whole process and just see. Because her method for actually turning the hem was different than what I had done in the past. In the past, I just simply turned it and whip stitched it. And it was okay. This was actually basically a Kitchener. It was like a Kitchener join, which was pretty incredible. And I think it's up on her, if you've ever knit one of her patterns, she has a link. And I think it's over on her Ravelry page too. So I think this is public. Where she has a bunch of her techniques and videos. She hasn't made the videos necessarily, but she links you to videos showing the technique. So this particular technique, you know, you knit an extra, you know, so that you can turn it, an extra spit of stockinette so you can turn it. I added a purl row because whenever I turn anything, ever since the first hat I ever made, which included a purl row at the turn, I've always done that because I just feel like it makes for a neater edge. So I think you can see that here. It just has a little purl. There's a single purl row. But when you go to turn the fabric, that purl row just wants to sit very nicely at the bottom like this. So I did add the purl row. And then you leave the live stitches on your needle and you Kitchener them to the stitches on your sweater. You can imagine, let us all just imagine for a moment, 250 some stitches that need to be Kitchenered together. Let's just pause for a moment of reflection. Yes, it took that long. It took hours. And I have a little video here of just the very end as I was working on these stitches. And you can see in the video that even though by that point I've gotten pretty like conversant with the method, it's still a little fiddly. So yeah, 250 stitches in, I was like, all right, I'm good at, I can do Kitchener, and I mean, I understand this, but it's just like, it's fiddly. So you'll see that in the video. But I feel like in doing that, I actually can visually, we were talking about spatial kind of issues last podcast. By doing that 250 sometimes, I could start to really visualize what was happening with the Kitchener stitch, like how it was working to go, you know, purl in one place and knit into another and pull a stitch off and join them together. You're creating, just like with Kitchener, you're creating an extra knit stitch here. And so by the end of it, I was like, oh, I totally like can visualize Kitchener now. Like I understand what's actually happening, which was very, very cool. And there's another couple of steps in the pattern that help you get this hem to be just right and help you join in just the right way that I won't give away, but that I really did like. I thought they were really useful for kind of lining yourself up so that you made sure that this hem was going to sit in the right place. You know, it wasn't going to be joined too high and have a weird bend in the front, or too low and flare out in the front. So I'll leave that to the pattern. But fiddly, yes. The end result, I think, is really, really beautiful. It gives the sweater a little bit of a, it's not a sweater, it gives the shirt, the summer springy top, a kind of weight at the bottom, which I really like. And you can see that it's sitting nice and flat all the way around. I did block it, and I didn't block it like to within an inch of its life or pin it or anything like that. I just blocked it flat and kind of smoothed out the seam, the turned hem at the end. And that's the result. I think it looks really, really nice. I'm very, very happy with it. Yeah. Can also add elastic down here into this turned hem. I'm not going to do that. I like my hems a little bit flippy, a little bit loose, I should say. There was an option for A-line shaping. I didn't do any of that. This is just straight for anybody who's wondering. I also changed the bottom by not doing a certain number of decreases down here. So I really like to keep the bottoms of my shirts around my hips like loose and free. It's one of my things. So by not doing the decreases and not changing needle size, I don't think the pattern calls for that, and by letting the hem kind of have its full circumference, I feel like what it ended up creating is almost like a little bit of A-line shaping in the garment, because the fabric is a little bit, it has a little bit of a drape and a flow to it rather than just a sticky kind of wool. So I feel like by doing all of those things, it ended up creating almost like an A-line shape at the bottom, and I'm pretty happy with that. Yeah, sorry, I was concluding the sweater, the shirt, and now I'm talking about it again. Really interesting pattern. Learned a lot about Ankestrick and how she thinks about patterns and knitting and different techniques. For me, that's like the best kind of pattern. Sure, it produces a relatively, you know, if you look at this, you're like, that's a pretty classic, timeless, kind of, some people might even say kind of plain garment. But the number and, you know, like type of technique that are mixed into the pattern are really, really interesting and useful. So for me, like a pattern like that is something I want to knit because it teaches me so much about knitting. I will say at the end, after all the Kitchenering and everything and being out of gauge, I ended up with this much yarn left over. That's also the sign of a really good pattern, I think. It called for, my size called for 2 skeins of this yarn, and I ended up with enough to do, you know, not a substantial swatch, but a swatch that was big enough, and this much yarn at the end. So yeah, that's not quite yarn chicken, but it's close, especially on a garment. But I'm pretty happy I don't have a lot left over. And I will save this, like I always do for all of my sweaters or garments. so that if I ever need to do a repair on it, I will have a little bit of the yarn left over. Yeah, it's my sweater bin. I have a little sweater bin where I keep all of those little extras, and that way I've had to do repairs before, and I can just go into the bin and pull out the scrap of yarn and do the little repair, and it's like, oh, it's done, it's great. So yeah, ONLi Blouse. That took a while. It's done. I'm happy with it, and I'm gonna add the elastic. We'll see how that goes. So let me move over to needle felting, which is something I've taken up recently, which I really love. And last episode, I showed you all Hamish the Highland Cow without any fur, because I had been working on the shape of his body for so long to try to get it just right. Because it's one of those things with needle felting, you might think, oh, if you just put the fur on, it doesn't matter what the body underneath looks like. But I wanted to take Hamish as a kind of opportunity to work on shaping and kind of like thinking about anatomy, and I had never worked on skinny little animal legs before, so yeah, it was a good opportunity to do all that. And I showed you him without all of his hair. Well, here he is with all of his hair. So this is Hamish. I'm not sure if I'm going to get the right angle on here. From some angles he looks a little bit more like a guinea pig in his face than a Highland cow. I'm okay with that. But from some angles, he really is totally adorable, and I'm hoping that's one of them. You can see his little pink nose came through. We were talking about whether or not his eyes were big or the right size. I think they're still a little bit big. I think that's what gives him the guinea pig hamster kind of look. But within all the fur, you do get to actually see his eyes, which is kind of cool. So, and I wanted to try, I mentioned this last time, I wanted to try felting eyes, because I had done glass eyes on the dragon, and these are felted eyes. So just wanted to see what would happen. And let's talk about a couple of things. So one of the things is that I'm glad his body didn't end up too big with all the fur. That's one of the tricks, I guess. You want to make the body the right size so that when you add the fur and the bulk of the fur, you're not, ending up with like out of proportion, right? His head still looks pretty much in proportion with the rest of his body. Another thing was that somebody asked about the horns, because I did say I was going to change the horns up. The horns were originally felted. Last episode's version of Hamish had felted horns, and they were just wire with wool on them, and I didn't like them at all. They were bothering me, they were spinning, they didn't look finished. So I went back this last week and used some Sculpey to create horns, and I know they're twisted and that looks a little bit maybe strange for a Highland cow. They would probably be smooth otherwise. I'm not super adept with my Sculpey yet, so the twisting was the way that I could make sure that I could get the wire in them, embedded in them, and then give them some body to make sure they were going to stay the right shape. And I have a little bit of footage of me making the horns here, so I'll put that in. And I ended up, because you would normally attach these horns earlier in the process so that you could actually really kind of wrap them, one technique at least would be to wrap them into the core wool frame of the animal. Since I was attaching them late, I did need to do a little bit of funny business to get them into the same hole that I had been using for the wire for the felted version, and then to get them in place to make sure they were going to stay, I did wrap around this part of his head. And Highland cow, the cows have that little bit of raised bit on the back of their head, so I used that to wrap the wire, and then I had to felt on top of it to make sure that it was hidden enough. So it was a little bit tricky, kind of like back. It was like a little bit of a retro fit. And then I added the hair on top, so you can see that his hair is all the way around the horns to really, it hides whatever's going on in there, and it looks pretty much like the horns are just coming out of his head. Hopefully you can see that on the camera. Yeah, so that was the horns, and that was Judy asked that question, like, so would you use Sculpey? And yes, I did, Judy. Sculpey. It's like a clay that you can shape, and then you just harden it in your home oven. So you just put it in the oven. These were in for about 12 minutes at a very low temperature. I think it's like 250 or 270 degrees. Same as what I did for the dragon's horns and for the dragon's little claws. So yeah, I would recommend Sculpey. I think it's fun. I'm not very good at it yet. I feel like there are a lot of tricks that I don't know, because there's a whole nother art, a whole nother craft to be able to work with clay and get it to come out the right way. So this is my rudimentary attempt at doing Sculpey horns for the Highland cow, but I kind of am pretty happy with the way they came out. What else? His hair, his fluff was so much fun. I've never put fluff on an animal like this before. I feel like I've seen doll makers and wig makers, I don't know why, maybe on YouTube somewhere, making the hair on a doll or making the hair on a wig. And it's a very similar process because you start from lower down, you know, putting in your bits of hair. And I do have a video of this, so I'll put that in here for you. You start low and you kind of build up the layers, and then I was trimming it kind of as I went, but I also gave him a kind of trim at the end. But it's like you're putting in little hair plugs. It's really kind of fun and relaxing. And you're doing them in different directions so that you get that kind of more natural look. I'm really particularly happy with the way that his back came out here. And this was all just a matter of putting the fluffs, the tufts of hair in at different, you know, variable kind of locations just to try to get it to work out. Even his tail has a little bit of fluff on it. I went ahead and fluffed his belly because I just felt like he needed to have a little something down here to just give him a little full body fluff. The tricky thing is this is all merino, and it will mat a little bit if you're handling it too much, so I'm really trying not to handle him too much at this point. He kind of sits by himself. Some people that I've seen, some felters, will actually attach their piece to like a stand, like felt them to a stand at that point, so that when they're working on the hair, they're not actually mussing around too much. And the instructions were good in that she mentioned trying not to put any felt here in this area until the very end, so that, you know, you're not touching it too much. So it's tricky. It's a tricky thing to do, but I'm pretty happy. I gave him a trim at the end. I'm pretty happy with the way that the fluff came out. I still think he's got a little bit, I mean, I think it would be better if this part were a little thinner. He looks a little gorilla to me from the front. So if this were a little thinner, like on the next time I do a kind of a cow of some kind, or whatever you think proportionally, a little bit thinner on the front would have been better. And then, like I said, I think his eyes still scream guinea pig, but he's very adorable. He's very sweet. He kind of sits over in his little enclosure with the dragon. He and the dragon have gotten to be good friends. So he's totally poseable because of all the wire. So all of his legs, you know, move up and down. His head has pretty good movement. You know, he could lay down or sit, and he kind of was while I was working on him at certain times. So yeah, so that's Hamish. He came out, I'm pretty happy with him. Like, for the first time doing a kind of quasi-realistic looking animal, not a dragon, I kind of like his personality. And I think, yeah, I'm happy with the way the hair came out for the first try. And there are a lot of things, each time you do a new project, right, you learn new things, which is really quite fun. So that's Hamish. And I wanted to mention, last time I said that the kit I got from World of Wool, which is this guy, I didn't think the instructions were all that, like, I needed more detail as a new kind of felter. And granted, this is for intermediates, so I was probably asking quite a bit from the pattern. But one thing I did is that I picked up this book, A Masterclass on Needle Felting, Wildlife, and it's by the same designer, the same needle felter, Cindy Lou Thompson, who does the kits for World of Wool. She does them under Chick Tin Creations, but it's the same person who does the World of Wool kits. This book of hers is awesome. So I think there's just maybe a disconnect with, like, making a World of Wool kit and needing to really just try to cram as much info as possible in a tiny little booklet. You know, the expectation, just like a lot of knitting patterns, the expectation was that you might have some more felting experience maybe and be able to look at photos or other reference books. I just felt like this wasn't sufficient, but I feel like the instruction that she gives in this book is absolutely sufficient. She goes through all the different steps, talks about why and how and the shaping, and shows you much more detail about how to create every kind of inch of the animals. So I just wanted to put in a plug for this. If you're interested in needle felting, you've picked up a World of Wool kit, and you too were like, I need more instruction, she does offer way more instruction in her books. So this is Cindy Lou Thompson. Really love her method and really enjoy this book a lot because I feel like I'm learning from it. She has a new book coming out on needle felting endangered species, I think. It's coming out in November, so that's in my cart. I'm pre-ordering that because I'm really curious to know about some of the other more, like, less common animals. Like this one does a badger and a fox and an otter, I think, and a rabbit, but the other one does some really cool birds and some other, kind of endangered species. So yeah, that's the needle felting. It's been fun to work on Hamish, and hopefully you enjoyed some of that close-up on the hair installation for Hamish, his wig. Yeah, but that's what I've been up to. I think I was trying to think of, like, some of you have been asking some needle felting questions, so I was kind of thinking that maybe I'll do one of these episodes where I do just a little, like, needle felting primer on the tools and stuff, an up-close version of what I use, just because I'm a total beginner. And if you're thinking of trying this, you might want to have a look at, like, what the basic things you need are. So maybe I'll do something like that coming up. But now for the giveaway. Speaking of sharing needle felting, last time I mentioned this was our little giveaway. It's a hummingbird wool pet set, and in here it's wool, needles, and some instructions on how to make these little hummingbirds. It doesn't include, like, the felt pad that you want to work on, so you can pick one of those up pretty easily at a little craft store. They're not very expensive. Yeah, so this was the giveaway, and this goes to, let me see, drum roll please, the winner was Linda. So Linda, I've contacted you on YouTube, and I just need you to send me your postal stuff so I can get this in the mail to you. You can send it to me at knittingthestash@gmail.com, and I will pop this in the post to you. Congratulations on winning, and thanks to everybody for sharing your multi-craftual maker stories as part of the giveaway. It was really fun to read all of your contributions, so thank you. So I think that's it. We have the ONLi Blouse, which came out beautifully, and we have Hamish. Hey, Hamish. So I wish you many hours and days of happy making, and I will see you back here hopefully in a couple of weeks. So take care. Bye-bye.